All right. So thank you so much. And I'm so happy to be here. Tessa, thank you for always reminding me of what I'm supposed to be doing research on and keeping myself focused because my list of things I want to do is really too long. Definitely thank you all. It's Friday, I know. And if your weather is anything like mine, you'd rather be outside. And hopefully if you are off camera, you actually are outside with the birds and enjoying some of this weather if it's decent outside. Let me get my screen shared here, make sure that we're all looking at the same thing today. Hopefully you all see my PowerPoint. Can I get a thumbs up? Something from or nodding? I see some nodding. Perfect. Thank you so much. And we definitely have time for Q&A at the end of this. This session will not go quite as long as last week's session where I was throwing so much information at you, a lot of details and definitions and things like that. But if you have a question as we're going through, please do not hesitate to go ahead and ask that question in the chat. Some of them I will probably try to address as I see them, or if Tessa happens to see them or Carolyn sees them, just throw them at me if they look really important right away. But we'll definitely have time at the end to make sure we're talking through some things. And so today the focus is on this idea of assessment, and especially the implications and applications for the work you're doing. And I'm going to break this down into basically 4 different things. We're going to talk first about the what, the why, and the how of doing EDI assessments. We're going to talk a little bit about the building blocks that make up EDI assessments. I'm going to spend a little time talking about individual EDI assessment projects, typically the types of things that you want to engage in, or you may have already started engaging in. And then I'm going to introduce the tool that I share and that I use a lot when I do consultations with libraries that help them do kind of an overarching organizational assessment as well. It's called the DASA. That's the nickname I've given it because it takes too long to say it the whole time, the whole title. And then I'm going to just spend just a couple of minutes talking to you about making sure you're ready to create your EDI assessment plan, because you do need to plan when you're actually going to do some solid EDI assessment. So starting with the what, the why, and the how. Now, you'll hear me sometimes use the word audit rather than assessment. And for the purpose of what we're talking about today, when I talk about EDI audits, I'm also talking about EDI assessment and vice versa. So you might hear every once in a while me referring to the audit, but I'm talking about assessment as well. And when we talk about this idea of assessments or audits, Hubbard gives us a really, I think, detailed definition of what we're trying to do with this process. And so the idea of doing a diversity audit is to make sure you're examining your strategy in terms of your culture, your systems, and your procedures against some type of strategic analysis framework. And you're doing this as a way to identify what's working well and what also might actually need more examination or more research done on it. And I think that piece is really important. So anytime you are doing something where you're assessing things, you do want to take the time to assess what's going well, what's working, and what you're actually succeeding at, as well as looking for the things that you're struggling with. There is a balance there. But there's also this idea of using this as a way to create a really strong action plan and to create those strategies that you need when you're actually thinking about improving the workplace or improving your library, even improving things for your community. And they also help you to benchmark or to actually track your improvement. One thing we typically forget when we do assessment is that we should be assessing over time, because you want to make sure you can actually measure your progress. It doesn't do you any good to assess something one time and then never assess it again. And the same thing definitely goes when we're talking about EDI. Now, when we really talk about EDI assessments, then this means that we are talking about something that can be seen as a systemic organizational change process. And so, yes, I just used the C word, change. Typically, if you're doing this type of assessment, you're going to change something. You're going to actually engage in something and then make some changes. But it's also a way for you to determine where you're currently at with the work you're doing. And yes, identify what you're doing really well, and then identify the things you want to work on further. And this is really necessary for helping you to guide the planning process and to create that baseline so that you can actually assess the progress that you have. And so a lot of people like to think of this as just a critical SWOT analysis. So you're trying to identify your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities, and your threats related to EDI within the workplace. So first things first, this goes back to what we talked about last week, which again, like Tessa said, feels like it was ages ago, but it's just last Monday. But one of the things I did was kind of bombard you with this idea of definitions and the importance of identifying a definition that we could all agree on. And I don't mean as a field, but I mean as those who are working together within our organizations. So the first thing you definitely do when you're talking about assessment is spend some time asking yourself, what do we even mean by EDI? Because you cannot properly assess something if the meaning is going to change on you in the middle of that process, or if people are interpreting the terms in a different way. So if I ask you all to assess yourselves on cultural competence, but you all came into the conversation with a different view of what cultural competence was, you can definitely assess yourself, but if I started making comparisons, you'd all be in different places because you'd be defining it in a different way. And then once again, the reminder that if you're talking about EDI, are you also talking about social justice, anti-racism, anti-bias, and do you also want to try to assess for that within the process of assessing for EDI? Now, as a reminder, sources of definitions, we talked about how ALA and also all of our other professional organizations give us really nice definitions that oftentimes align with the work we're doing, are really good starting places. But many of you also need to take a step back and look at your districts, look at your communities, look at your cities, look at your universities, because oftentimes they're going to have definitions that are laid out that you are expected to at least acknowledge, if not adhere to, when you're doing your own work as well. So always good to take that step back as well to see if something already exists. Now, of course, if these entities don't have anything in place yet, then you can go find something that works for you and build around that. But usually there's going to be something that they're going to expect you to at least understand or know about, and then you do the work to align, hopefully, your definition with theirs in a way that works for you as well. Now, the second thing we're going to be doing here is trying to figure out what we actually want to get from this process. And typically, when we're thinking about this, it's the idea of planning something after the fact. So how are you planning to use the findings from your assessment? And so part of your assessment plan is going to be the after the assessment plan. You know, you go to the party, then you go to the after party. And the after party is actually more fun, right? Because that's where stuff is actually happening. Same thing with this assessment process. You have your assessment part and then you have your after the assessment where you've got all this data, all this information, and you can now do something with it. The other thing you ask yourself is, are we going to repeat it? Are we not going to repeat it? And I'm going to tell you now, this is a rhetorical question. You're going to repeat it because the important part of this, once again, is that you're going to have baselines, you're going to have benchmarks, you're going to have a way to check your progress. So of course you have to do it again. The real question for many people is, when do we do it again? Do we do it again after 6 months? Do we do it again after a year? Is it 2 years? Is it 3 years? And that really is going to depend on one, what you're assessing, and two, when you need the information. And then also three, the number of people you might have who are available to do the work and when people are able to engage in the process as well. Now, the final question is the one that's often hardest for anyone to address, but it's, are you going to be ready for what you might find? And this is where we have to acknowledge that sometimes what we get out of this assessment isn't positive. It isn't flattering for the organization. And it's actually important that we identify those things because we need to address them, but it's hard to see. It's always hard to get something back when you do an assessment and you see that there's a gaping hole and that maybe you need to address that gaping hole, but it's going to be better off in the long run if you do it early. If you actually identify the gap, identify the problem, and then you can work towards addressing it. So now when we talk about actually conducting these assessments, we talk about having some building blocks. And your building blocks are going to be the things that it's essential for you to determine before you actually get started. And so we start with the who, and this is basically who's going to be involved in the process, who's going to participate in the assessment. You've got the what, and these are the aspects of the organization that you want to assess. So what are you looking at? What pieces of your organization are you actually paying attention to? The how is which processes are you going to try to apply to make sure you actually can conduct your assessments. And then of course the when, and this is that time frame that's going to help you to actually know what you're doing, when you're doing it, and when you're expected to complete the process as well. So when we talk about who's going to be involved, you have to first identify who's leading this process. Now, a lot of people will argue that you should do it top down because you need to have the top administration supporting the process and kind of getting things going. Other people are going to argue that it should be bottom up, more grassroots. People who are more highly engaged in the work, who are actually doing the day-to-day should be more engaged in that process. My argument is that it should be a mixture of all these people who are actually coming from different areas and different aspects. But no matter what, you do have to have someone in the upper administration who is ready to support the process, which means that someone's going to be ready to lend a hand with time, money, resources, those types of things to at least acknowledge that they need to make room for this work to happen and to make sure people have the permission to do this work within the organization. Now, when you're also thinking about who's going to participate, you want to decide if it's going to be internal only. So it's just only about us. Are we all just going to chip in and do this work and look at ourselves? Or are we also going to do a little bit of external work? And I'm going to talk a little bit later about a couple of things where if you're doing this type of assessment, you want some external viewpoints as well. It can't just be internal people. It can't just be this group of people who've always worked together, always doing the work together, who are the only ones looking at what's happening, especially when you're looking at something like your policies, which likely impact other people. And you need to make sure that you actually include them in that process. Now, if we ask what we're going to assess, you can actually decide if you're going to assess the whole organization, which means you're usually focused a little bit more on things like strategies and the structure of the organization and how you do things, the processes. Or are you going to look at different parts of the organization, which means you're probably looking at the people and the work that people do, things like rewards, and also that external outreach collaboration aspect of the work you also do. And then, of course, all of this can actually be bunched up together. You can actually have a whole organization assessment that looks at people, rewards, external. You can also do piecemeal assessment that looks at processes, structures, and strategies as well. Now, the hardest thing for most people to decide is which approach to take. You can definitely do this internally. You can rely on internal surveys, focus groups, do some content analysis of your policies and your procedures, do process reviews. Spend a lot of time creating focus groups or small groups to actually do these projects. People who are engaged in a certain project and then move to the next project once they're done. You could also do this externally, which means you can go find a commercial survey, a commercial assessment tool. You could hire a consultant. You could use the data that I'm going to introduce, which actually I see the data as more of a bridge. It's something that you can actually do internally, led internally, but it's created by someone outside of your organization. But those types of external reviews do tend to be more large scale. It's more of an overview of your organization that you then use to identify some of the smaller things you want to work on, some of those smaller projects you actually want to spend time and attention on. And then the final thing, of course, is the timeline. And so the reminder is that doing EDI assessments, it's not short-term. This is not a short-term process, but you can actually do different parts of the assessment over short periods of time. So those are those strategic projects that you identify and you say you're going to accomplish them over 3 to 6 month periods of time, a year to 2 years, depending on the project as well. You also want to consider aligning something like this with your strategic planning process. So if you're coming up on a strategic planning cycle already, integrating EDI assessment into that is just a natural fit. It's a good time to do it. Also aligning it with your financial budget timelines. If you're considering external consultants or things like that, making sure you have the funds available, or if you know you're going to have funds you have to spend. It's a good time to consider whether or not you want to purchase one of these packages you can actually get where you can do a climate assessment of your organization or something like that. And then also a reminder to think about your internal assessment and review timelines. If your organization is already engaged in doing their self-assessment that we are all required to do, we're doing this right now. I've got to finish pulling mine together by March 1st. Haven't even looked at it. What have I done for the last year? But if you're getting ready to do that, then that's probably not the right time to introduce another project, to introduce another thing that people need to work on. They need to focus on what they're finishing at that time. They're focused on their assessment, their review, their evaluation of themselves, and sometimes their staff as well. Or you may find it's a perfect time to introduce at least the conversation of adding EDI into the workplace, into some of the work they're doing as they're thinking about their assessments as well. Now, I wanted to take a few minutes just to talk a little bit about some of the more prominent EDI assessment projects that typically we are already taking on in libraries, or maybe you're considering taking on some of these projects and you haven't quite considered or decided how you're going to address them. But I wanted to talk about them briefly and then hopefully open up the conversation for questions about, okay, I'm thinking about that, but what should I do next as well? And of course, the one that we are all probably doing right now, assessing our collections. And EDI collection assessment has a number of approaches that are out there. Most of you are probably familiar with many of these approaches. Maybe you haven't thought about them in terms of EDI, but you probably looked at your collections in terms of being demand-driven or supported by a software package or based on the percentages of materials that you actually have. So we're talking about EDI, though, if we're talking about demand-driven, we are really looking at this in terms of doing a community analysis or even doing a market segmentation, which, of course, business term that we can definitely apply to the work we do. If we think about buyers in terms of being patrons and think about purchasing in terms of library use. And so if you're thinking about doing a market segmentation, you're thinking about identifying all your different patrons, grouping them based on some commonality related to how they use the library, and then getting a better understanding by actually talking to them about their needs and what they want in the library. Now, of course, this process means you also need to take a step back and identify your non-users, the ones that you haven't been able to get into your library or information organization in the first place, but who probably need the same level of engagement in terms of understanding their needs, and may actually need more, because maybe the reason why they haven't been using the place, that the organization, the library, is because there's nothing there for them, or at least they feel there's nothing there for them. Demand-driven makes sense for most of us. Now, software-supported ones are becoming a little more popular because they're meant to save you time. Now, those who work in school library settings, especially, tend to already have vendors who are starting to integrate this into their packages, where you can actually do an EDI analysis of your collection based on what you already have. You don't see it as much in the public and academic libraries, but we're starting to see it. We're starting to see vendors actually implementing this, so you can actually start looking for specific materials based on some identity or some EDI-based identity that people are interested in. Now, the ones that are based on percentages are the ones that we're starting to see a lot of. There's a lot of examples online of how to do these in terms of determining the percentage of particular materials that you're finding in your collection, and then determining if you need to add more materials to the collection. I do spend a little more time on this because it's about numbers, and we talk a little bit about numbers, but if you're going to do a percentage-based analysis, you definitely need to decide what section you're going to focus on or what topics you're going to focus on. And of course, if you're in a larger library, you definitely need to pick logical sections, because it's too much. You can't do the entire collection if you've got, of course, close to 1 million items in your collection. But the other thing you want to think about then, of course, is what are you actually going to be assessing for? And there's so many things you could look at. And what we typically tell our students here is that they need to focus on either logical groupings of things so they can go through one at a time, or they're going to have to remind themselves they may have to do multiple of these assessments. So if you're going through specifically looking for diverse authors, maybe you're actually more focused on social economic diversity. Maybe you're more focused on neurological challenges, mental health, those types of things. Maybe it is LGBTQ culture, gender identity, immigration, refugees. I mean, all these things that you could choose to review your collection for, in an attempt to make sure your collection is actually supporting these topics and supporting people who are interested in these topics. But it's, of course, going to be a time-consuming process the larger your collection actually is. And then, of course, we pull our wonderful shelf list that tells us everything from when it was published, how much it circulated, and when was the last time it was checked out, because we need that information to also help us with the weeding process, because we understand that we can't just keep adding things to the collection and not understand that we might need to remove things from the collection as well. But this also gives us that list of items that we're going to start reviewing to check against, hopefully, another list of items. But when you're doing this percentage process, really all you're doing is looking for the materials and trying to match them up with whichever diversity aspect you chose. So whichever identity, whichever grouping you chose, you're actually just identifying whether or not the book falls into that category. And then the next step, of course, is just to determine those percentages. And that's the numbers. So you count the total number of items you have on your shelf list in that section. You then count the number of books that actually hit the category that you were looking for. You do a little bit of division in terms of, in this case, you divide 9 by 105, and you find out that 8.5% of your collection, in this case, was looking at something like own voices. So you identify 8.5% of that section of your collection having own voices in it. The real question people usually ask me is then, okay, so if I have 8.5, is that good? Is that bad? And really that depends on the determination you have to make. I can't tell you whether 8.5 is good or bad. The other thing we often don't know is that 8.5%, is there anything else out there to even add to the collection? That's a whole other conversation to have about publishing and what's available on certain topics as well. But at least this process gives you a sense of the numbers. And if you're seeing things that are like 0.05% or 0.5%, less than 1%, then you probably are at least being a little concerned about whether or not you need to reallocate some money to purchasing items to add to those sections. Now, a lot of people actually find it easier to do a reverse EDI collection assessment, because it means you have a list to work from, and then you go check from that list to your collection, and someone has already maybe created a list for you that tells you which items should you actually have, which titles should you actually have in your collection. And we definitely know that in our field, we have lots of these lists available. People have created hundreds, if not thousands, of these lists of items that they suggest you might have based on different EDI topics, different discussion areas, different everything. Now, for those who are looking for specifically diverse books, We Need Diverse Books is still a great site for that. They've listed a lot of those lists that are available for you as well. And another example is like the Hijabi Librarians website, where they actually also do the book reviews, which many people find very useful if they are reviewing a concept or an area they're just not familiar with, and they need to know how to make a decision about whether or not that book also is high quality and does it belong in our collection as well. But this is just that general sense of I'm doing this assessment, and maybe if I have a list to work from, it's a lot easier for me to actually determine what I need versus going in and just looking at percentages. Now, you can also look at percentages here. How much of this list do I actually have, and see if you're how well you're doing in that sense. And I'd never suggest to someone they take this list with the idea that they should buy every item on a list and add it to their collection, because you do still need to go back to that first idea of looking at your community and whether or not you actually need to have those items in your collection for your community as well. The other thing that we talk about assessing, especially for EDI, are policies. And I always suggest that if you're going to do any type of policy assessment, that you need to first create a group of people who represent various entities and identities in your organization to form a group to do this review. One person cannot properly review every policy of a library, and one person should not be tasked with doing that as well. You also need to identify all your policies, both internal and external, and sometimes the ones that are not written down yet that should be written down. And then try to determine a process for working through those policies. And usually this is why you have a group. So you determine how you're going to approach it, also who's going to cover which policy and that process as well. And then from that point, you need to have some type of rubric or a scale as a way to assess each policy for EDI based on the criteria that you're looking for. And this is something I'm actually going to provide for you all. I'm going to give you a bunch of links after this session and also a few files. And one of those files is a rubric for helping you to assess policies for EDI, for anyone who's interested in using that as well. And then once you've looked at these things, you've done your rating, the next step, of course, is making those updates or changes as needed. But this is where you also need to consider piloting your policies. And this is not something that we do a lot of. But especially if your policy is going to impact other people, and that could include other coworkers, but it could also include your community, you need to actually pilot that policy with them, which means having them also look at that policy and help you to identify any issues or concerns in terms of equity and inclusion within their policies. It wouldn't hurt also to have some of those people on the group that's actually doing the review, but that's a little bit harder to accomplish, especially if you're talking about the external community. But it's definitely a suggestion that we make as well. Now, the other thing that we don't talk enough about, and especially in terms of making sure that we are functioning in our organizations in terms of being equitable, being inclusive, is actually assessing our processes. And yes, policies and processes are connected. We typically think of policies, though, as those written down things that we have that usually serve as guidelines for what people do or should not be doing or should be doing in our organizations. Processes, though, tend to be the actual way people do things, the actual way they perform certain tasks. And when we talk about whether or not we are paying attention to being inclusive within the process of maybe cataloging or doing metadata, or even it being inclusive in the way that we perform chat service in terms of reference, we don't often think about that in terms of EDI, even though we've definitely seen some research coming out that talks about this is something we need to worry about. It's a concern in terms of how we interact with different patrons and whether or not their identities and our identities impact that work. And so two of the ways you could consider doing this is actually usability testing, which we often do in libraries anyway. But cognitive walkthroughs and heuristic observations are basically different ways for you to go through the process or have an expert go through the process of doing something and performing a task. And with the cognitive walkthrough especially, this is a process where the person is actually sort of speaking out loud. They're commenting along the way about why they do the things they do, or the choices that they're making, or if they're skipping steps, why they're skipping steps, those types of things. And what you're doing, of course, as the person assessing this is actually looking at the task and looking at the comments and seeing not only about success, which is what usability testing is really about, but if you're talking about doing this for EDI, you're looking for opportunities where someone could have been more inclusive, or you're looking for spots in the process where someone was actually being exclusive or making a decision that was biased in some way. And so that allows you to then identify that step in the process and see if other people are also hitting that same point, and hopefully make some changes so that that's not happening as people are making their decisions and moving forward. Now, the heuristic observation is very similar. The difference is that you're actually just getting your experts, these are the people who normally engage in the process, to carry out an evaluation based on a set of principles. So for something like this, let's say you wanted to apply certain principles to information literacy instruction, and let's say you went ahead and identified the principles set up by ACRL, and you wanted to see if people were carrying out the work they did within those principles, then you get the experts to do that work. Same idea of using it to identify potential problems or issues related to the work they're doing. And then instead of just looking at the analysis of the comments, you also just debrief with the experts in terms of their experiences and really get them to talk through what they think can be done to help fix any problems that they actually identified. Now, the other thing that we definitely do a lot of in libraries is assess our programming. And if you're not assessing your program, of course, that means you're already starting to think about what Dr. Bright's saying in terms of assessing your program. But it's a reminder that there are multiple ways that you can go about assessing your programs, including doing the surveys that we always like to do, especially of our attendees, but also debriefing with staff, very similar to the heuristic evaluation that I just talked about. But the idea of talking to staff about the process of creating the programming, what went into that, and all the decisions that are being made, and also their experience running the program, their experience for after the program, and really hopefully identifying any potential issues related to EDI, especially, that they can really kind of meek out and really figure out what's going on. Definitely doing focus groups for your attendees and having conversations with them, and then observations. And those observations can be of both attendees and also of the staff who are running the program from an external viewpoint, as a way to once again pinpoint potential issues or concerns you may have, and then be able to hopefully move forward with solutions in the process as well. All right, so I'm going to take just a quick water break because I'm talking way too much. But I wanted to take a moment to introduce the tool that I talk about a lot. And for those who are going to ask, yes, I will be providing a link for you to access this tool. I do make this tool available to anyone who's interested in using it. And it does not cost you anything to use the tool if you're interested in using the tool. So I like to say that up front. And what this tool is really trying to do is that idea of assessing your entire organization based on your strategies, your structures, your processes, the people who work there, rewards, which is also acknowledgement, and also the environment or external factors that may impact your organization. And a recent addition to it has been looking at accessibility for both your users and for your employees as well. And so what I'm going to do now is kind of walk through each of these sections to give you a sense of what's kind of covered there. And so when we talk about strategy, this is where you're thinking about your strategic planning. You're thinking about all of those statements that you typically make available to the public, your mission, your vision, your values, any internal policies that you actually have. If you have a DEI plan, or if you don't have a DEI plan, maybe consider creating one. And then the importance of those definitions. This goes back to the idea of making sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what we're talking about. And then any statements that you've made as an organization related to EDI, which could be statements related to anti-racism, to social justice, things like that. But anything that you've posted as an organization-wide statement that typically is indicative of your approach to the work you actually do. Now, the structure is where you're thinking about the decision-making process, especially in terms of transparency in decision-making. If you're doing assessment, what that assessment looks like and what you actually are assessing, the dedication and commitment of the organization, but especially the leadership to EDI, how communication takes place, especially internal communication, how acknowledgement of the work is done, at least for broad views of acknowledgement, and also looking at a little bit of what collaborative efforts may already be in place and financial resources in place to support EDI efforts in the organization as well. Now, processes are talking about things like your data collection, your decision-making as a process. And there's a lot of overlap in some aspects of this process because it's about looking at a topic like decision-making from multiple viewpoints, multiple avenues. But processes also looks at training and learning opportunities, your programming and your services, can definitely look at your collection development. There's a new edition that looks at information literacy instruction, and then also how you get feedback from your community, both internal and external, in terms of the EDI work you're actually doing. Now, the rewards section looks at everything from salary, compensation, to professional development opportunities, to if you are in an organization that has tenure or promotion, what that evaluation process looks like, and then also whether people are being acknowledged or rewarded for their professional contributions as well. Now, the people section tends to be the most difficult one for most people to struggle through when they're doing this process, because it is a little bit about the demographic representation of those who work in the organization, which can sometimes be difficult to ascertain, and also in some cases illegal to ask people about. So it can be very difficult to identify that. But it is important to look at things like your climate, the actual assessment evaluation piece that people go through, opportunities for people to engage, and then also education and training from the perspective of the people doing that education and training, and then also the valuing of DEI work done by individuals. Now, the environment or external factors are looking at the partnerships in terms of the collaborations that take place between your organization and those outside the organization. It also includes whether or not you've done a community analysis, whether or not you've done a community climate assessment in terms of their use of your services. This looks at your programming from the community perspective, also your services and your collections and your outreach, and also service to the field in a broader sense from the perspective of those outside of the organization. And as I mentioned, the last section that was added is looking at accessibility, both for your users and employees. And this section was added as a way to acknowledge that accessibility, especially in our organizations, tends to be big enough not to have to fit within other places, and really just didn't fit as well. And so what it's really looking at are things related to accommodations and the ability to support people who need accommodations. Technology in terms of whether it's provided or whether it's needed, also access, and that's both physical and virtual or digital access, confidentiality issues that may come with that as well, and then the support that people might need, including training to support people who may have different needs as they come into your spaces as well. But after all that, what people usually ask me is, what are they actually measuring? And with this tool, they're really looking more at your efforts. You're looking at your abilities. You're looking at your focus areas where you're spending your time. You're also able to start taking an initial look at your progress and also areas of improvement. But of course, if you do the DASA once and then you do it again, you get a clearer picture of your progress and your improvement as well. And in terms of how you're actually rating these things, the scale actually runs from non-existent all the way up to expert. And it allows you to acknowledge that in some cases, some of these things are not being planned, are not being considered by the library. And it's not a negative mark, it's just an indication that you're not considering these items. And it's up to the library to consider whether or not it's important enough to add these things to the list of EDI efforts that we're going to engage in. Novice looks at the idea that you're maybe talking about something, considering doing it, but there's nothing in place yet. There's no actions to back it up. Intermediate allows you to say that we've implemented this or we started it, but it hasn't been going on for a while if it's a new activity. And if it's long-term, you just may not have any data yet to support whether or not it's a positive activity or whether you need to change your activity or how successful you've been. And if it's something that's a little bit more like a one-time or a short-term activity you did just once, you still haven't had the chance to determine the impact or of the implementation of what you did. By the time you hit the advanced level, you're talking about being more actively engaged in the activity, usually over either a short period of time or a long extended period of time. And you have data available to begin assessing the impact of the work you're doing. And if it's a short-term activity, then efforts have already been made to determine the impact of implementing this change or implementing this thing within the organization. And then expert level is where you're fully engaged in the activity over an extended period of time. You've got data available and you've used that data to both assess the impact and potentially make changes or updates based on that information. So by the time you hit expert level, you're in that loop. You're in the loop of assessment where you're actually looking at something, benchmarking it, looking at it again, improving and seeing progress as well. The data also allows you to acknowledge that some things just don't apply to your organization, and also allows you to acknowledge that you simply don't know. So coming from your perspective, if you're doing this particular type of assessment, you may not know the answer, but you don't want to give it a rating that doesn't actually align with what's actually happening in the organization. And so after all that, I mentioned this was going to be more about asking questions today. The final thing I want to remind you of is that if you're going to be doing EDI assessments, you really do have to plan for that as well. You don't want to just jump into this idea that I'm going to do an EDI assessment and not really have a clear-cut plan in place first. And so I'm actually going to include, as part of what I send along in terms of this slides, the information, links to the data, all the rubrics, all those things that I've talked about. I'm also going to send you a planning worksheet. That is a reminder of the things you should be looking for and the questions you should be asking yourself when you're ready to start engaging in EDI assessment within your organization, as a way to hopefully just help you with that process. Step 1, step 2, I think if I'm not mistaken, there's 6 steps on the worksheet. It's not rocket science from my perspective at all, but it is something just designed to help you pull everything into one place. And it's not, you're not going to be able to answer. And in some cases, it's going to be something you need to sit down with others in your organization and talk through. You're not going to be the person with the answer, and that's perfectly fine. But hopefully it will serve as a guide for you, something you can actually use when you're ready to move forward and actually get that work done. And so, as I said, with that said, enough of me throwing stuff at you. I wanted this to be a little bit more about opportunity to ask questions, share examples, and also have some discussion about some of the things I've talked about today, or also an opportunity to ask questions about things I didn't get a chance to cover and you'd like me to address in the time we have left. And I will stop sharing so that I can see you all again. And I acknowledge it is Friday afternoon and most of you are tired from the week and you've probably had lunch and you're probably ready to go home. So questions, thoughts, concerns, things that we can address as well. Oh, I see a hand. And it looks like M. Parker.
Yes.
Yes,
I wanted
please.
to ask, can you explain SWOT?
Yes. So if you are doing a SWOT analysis, especially from the perspective of EDI, so SWOT is just means strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And the process is you looking at your organization and looking sometimes at a specific part of the organization, but really trying to identify where you've got something that would be classified as a strength in place to support your EDI efforts. And your strengths can be everything from people. It could be the fact that you have funding in place. It could be the fact that you've got certain materials in place that you can actually use to help support the organization. So a strength can be just about anything, but it's just something that you have in place that's going to help you to be successful in the work you're doing. Now, when you're thinking about weaknesses, it can be everything from, especially when we talk about EDI, it can be a mindset. It can be that the fact that the organization has a negative mindset towards EDI, that's a severe weakness. And you have to overcome that weakness in order to be successful. But weaknesses could also be lack of people to do the work. We're understaffed and you don't have enough people to engage. It could be lack of funding. It could be anything that usually when I say it's a weakness, it's something you don't have. Simply you just don't have it, or it's a negative aspect of the organization. Opportunities are areas where you think you could easily move the organization because there's a door opening for you there. So an opportunity could be something like what we're planning to do here. I can apply for consultation hours with Dr. Bright. That's an opportunity for my organization to engage in this work a little bit further. Opportunities can even just be professional development opportunities, like, oh, there's a great event we can all attend, and it's going to help us with the process of understanding how to do this work. Or maybe there's someone who's donated books or funds or something to the organization that you can apply directly to, say, building an EDI collection. Those are opportunities that you could look at as well. And then the threats are things that unfortunately we often don't have as much control over as we would like to, but threats could be everything from an administration that refuses to make change, that refuses to allow you to engage in the work you need to do. Threats could be your community taking your budgeting away because they don't want you buying books that they don't agree you should have in the organization. Those are the things that are identified as threats to the organization, threats to the work you want to do. And typically the area that people have to focus most of their attention on, because those are the things that sometimes supersede anything else, supersede strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, depending on what the threat actually is.
Thank
Other
you.
questions? Oh, no, you're very welcome. Yes. Other questions? Everybody's like, I don't want to talk today. You can feel free to use the chat as well, please.
While people are thinking of their questions, can you tell us a little bit more about how your tool works? Does it, your assessment, so is it how they get the data? Is it like, I know you have a form and then
Yes.
the data goes somewhere and then they can, I don't know where. So could you talk just for a few minutes about how that works? And then,
Yes.
I'll bet we'll get more questions.
Yes. So officially, with the way it's set up, you can actually access the data either as a Qualtrics form, which is how I have it set up here, where if you do fill it out as a Qualtrics form, it comes to me, but you also get an email with your data. Now, of course, that's not the easiest way to use that data. And what I do encourage people to do is to, if you, especially if you have access to Qualtrics at your organization, you can actually ask me to send you the Qualtrics export for your own Qualtrics, upload it and use it on your own server. And that way the data comes to you. You don't have to worry about asking me to send you that information. And yes, I do that without asking you to consult with me or anything like that. I'm happy to send that file out. I'm happy to also send you the information if you submit through the actual Qualtrics form of mine. I can pull those out and send that information to you as well. But that's one of the ways. The other way is it's just also a Word form, and some people don't mind doing it. It's just as a Word document, and they go through and do it by hand or go through and type on it as well. You can definitely complete it that way. It just means that if you're wanting to get a better understanding of maybe some means or medians or averages or things like that, that part's missing from the Word document. You have to do that yourself. The main thing that also goes along with the data set is information on how to actually complete it, in terms of not just having one or two people go in and try to complete the data for the entire organization. The recommendation is that as many people as you can get in the organization come together in small groups and complete it as small groups. How you put your groups together is going to depend on your organization. Some have had a lot of success by doing it, you know, the administrators work together, the librarians work together, the staff, the students, different groups that way. Others have done it based on departments. And so each department gets together and works on it because they all have a better understanding of the work they're doing in their department. So it's easier to have that group conversation. And that is the key part of it, is making sure you have as many voices as possible working on that particular process, because not one single person is going to know every single thing about EDI practices in any organization, and especially in terms of the depth of work that some people are doing that they may not be sharing very widely. And so that goes along with it. I provide videos and also like just links or handouts where people can read through how I suggest going through it. And that way it's accessible to more people, because I'm not accessible to all people. And I recognize that I do still have another job and I have other things to do. And I want to make sure people can actually still apply it as well.
It's very generous of you to make that tool available and that people can use it in such a way that they can get the data through your Qualtrics system, which is pretty nice.
Yeah, I'm also trying to find a way to go ahead and put it into SurveyMonkey and a few other forms, so that if people also want to access it that way, I can also send the file if that's what they're using for their organization. So that, because Qualtrics, I definitely know is something I have access to. Not everybody wants to pay for access to Qualtrics, so a little bit daunting. Yeah.
You have a question in the chat.
Yes. So how do you set timelines? I'm sure this depends in large part on the size of the organization community. What else to keep in mind? Yeah, absolutely. I think typically what I always suggest people do is, no matter what you're doing and thinking of timelines, you always just want to make sure that it's something reasonable. You don't want to set a timeline so short that you're going to put a time crunch on the work and you're going to get low quality out of the whatever assessment work you're actually doing. But you also don't want to set it so far in the future, like 2-3 years in the future, for something that could be done in 6 months to a year, that you never do it, where you keep pushing it off, or where certain things happen that lead to barriers to you completing that work. So I usually suggest you start with the idea of doing your timeline in either 6-month or 1-year increments. Those are usually logical timelines. And within the work, you're probably going to set some sub goals of, okay, within 6 weeks, we're going to do this. And then in the next 6 weeks, we're going to do this as we build up to that 6-month mark. And it's okay also to remind yourself that you can push a timeline. It happens all the time. I'm working on a research project right now that was supposed to be done in December of last year. It is not December right now. We keep having to push the timeline because things are happening. But it's also not putting that extra pressure on ourselves to say that if we don't get this done by December 31st, that we're not going to finish it. But it's just a reminder that you have other things going on in your organization. And it's always easier for me to think about this in terms of academic organizations because I was an academic librarian for 12 years. I always try to plan around what I know are logical busy times and then less busy times in the organization. And so we do nothing in August, right? Don't even try it because we're ramping up for the first semester of classes to start. Things start to wind down a little bit in December. You might get a little bit of that time over the winter break. Things ramp up again early in spring, but they usually get quiet a little bit faster in spring. And then graduation hits, and then you have summer. And there's this idea that summer's quiet in libraries. And we know this is not the truth. Summers are often the busiest time that we have, especially academic libraries, getting work done. But that's also a good time to plan to do that work because you have to plan to do it. So maybe you make decisions about saying, we're going to set aside summer of 2023 to run the DASA assessment over the summer for our organization, and then be prepared for the fall to put together a plan based on what we actually found in that process, and a plan that's going to start sometime in January, maybe February of the next year. But that gives you a nice 6 months to almost 9 month route of trying to put something together and making sure that you're actually giving time to the work. So that's the other thing. I say summers are busy. They're busy because we plan to do things in the summer. So just plan to do this in the summer and it'll actually maybe hopefully get done. I say maybe hopefully. Other things come up, people show up with new things and you have to accomplish things on short time, and it really puts a wrench in the plan. But at least if you have this as a priority, you can make time for it, make sure it is actually a plan. I see another question here. Are there some good examples of public library EDI assessment plans that we can take a look at? I think I have a couple on my list, but if not, I'll make sure before I send out to you all, I'll do a little searching. There are some public libraries have done some really good engagement with EDI work because their communities have done that work, and it's really fantastic to see. Interestingly enough, I know there's one from Canada that I need to find for you, that I need to pull for you, because they did some really impressive work with their community in terms of assessing themselves and allowing the community to be fully engaged in that process. And so if I can find their plan, I'll definitely add it to my list. But I have a nice long resource list that I'm going to provide for you all of examples of different EDI assessment plans, but also just different EDI like action plans. How do we engage in this work? How do we write a good goal or good outcome? What are the activities that go along with that? And that actually might also help you with the timeline question. Seeing what the timelines were set for some of those activities might help you get a good sense of whether or not that's a feasible timeline for you for a similar project as well. Mike wants to know if there's a good number of items to start with. Yes, absolutely. So when you do the DASA, even when I do it as a consultant, there are usually more recommendations than any library can possibly do. That's just going to be the process of what happens. The goal, though, is to give yourself a long enough list where you can then come together as an organization and make a decision about the top priority. And I usually say, set your top priority to 3. 3 things you want to try to accomplish over that first planning period you give yourself. So like the 6 month to 1 year planning period, 3 things that you want to try to accomplish. More than 3, and you're typically going to already be pulling yourself too thin to accomplish things, or also just too much, trying to fit too much into the time you have. You also could just, let's just say, be strategic. 1 thing. Let's be honest about it. Just do 1 thing, especially if your organization has struggled to do this work. Pick 1 thing. It could be a low-hanging fruit thing, because usually when you do the recommendations, you'll have something that's low-hanging and easy for you to get to. Do that 1 thing first, have that feeling of success, and then build on that and maybe pick 2 things as your next project and build up to the 3 projects. But I definitely wouldn't suggest doing more than 3 when you first start out, because you don't want to actually have too many people being pulled in too many directions when you're engaging in that work. Let's see, next question. Oh, yes, yeah, and you're welcome. I got some stakeholders who are interested in creating a diversity collection that's a subset of the regular collection. I'm more interested in increasing the diversity of the collection across the board rather than singling out particular communities. What are your thoughts on this? I actually, my viewpoint has been that the items that are considered to be diverse belong in the collection. They're just part of the collection. If we think about how our collections are actually put together, we can always pull out things that we can emphasize or showcase, of course, but we shouldn't build a diversity collection that's always going to remain separate from the regular collection, because why would you do that? Those books belong in the collection for anyone to have access to. Doesn't mean you can't build a special page to point people to those items and make sure they can find them. But if you're talking about building a separate diversity collection and then setting it off to the side, it always just reminds me of the whole separate but equal conversation that we used to have. And that means it's not equal, but it's very much separate. We don't want to necessarily go back to that. For me, it's more about emphasizing what is in the collection and being able to emphasize that you have these items in your collection, and not just during certain months. So yes, Black History Month is important. It's Black History Month right now. We should be celebrating, but that shouldn't be the only month that we're showcasing Black authors of a good note. Any author of note can be celebrated at any particular time. And we can definitely use Black History Month and other months to help us to, raise that level of engagement. But it doesn't mean you can't do a fantastic display on something related to Native American history, and you're not having to wait till a month that's actually set aside for that. So I think it's positive that you actually have stakeholders who want to create a collection, a diversity collection. There's an acknowledgement there that you need those items. So for me, that's a good thing. But personally, and this is, once again, this is Dr. Bright's viewpoint, not the viewpoint of anyone else. Personally, I'm going to suggest that you don't create a separate section for diversity, that you get these items, that you include them in your collection, and that you find a way to help celebrate them and let people know they're there, but don't make it to be where they're always separated out, unless, especially if it doesn't make sense. If it doesn't fit into the classification system we already have, then let's not create a separate classification system for just those items. So just a thought. It's a tough question too, because that one for me, there's the side of me that's excited that we acknowledge we need the items. And I'm really excited about that. I'm really excited that stakeholders are interested in spending the funds to get the items. But I'm always concerned about making things where, let's just say, drawing attention to them in a way that other people might start protesting the way that you've drawn attention to them as well. So put them in the collection, make sure people can find them. We definitely know in our field we need to work on how we organize our collections anyway and helping people find information. But let's not make it to the point where it becomes this special thing that then draws negative attention to it. And then people start arguing for identical collections being created, because that's usually what happens next. It becomes this avalanche of people saying, well, now I want this in a separate collection as well. If you're going to create this collection, if you're going to start doing that, and then just throw out your organization system and just start creating special collections everywhere. I don't think that's the intent of the library, or also conducive to helping anybody find anything. We already live in an age of, I need that blue book with the horse on the cover, which, yes, I've done that. I'm so sorry. I was a bad child. But we're already in that age. That's not going to necessarily help us with our organization as well. All right. Other questions? These are actually good questions. This is the type of things, the type of conversation we don't usually get a chance to engage in. So I invite you to hit me with the hard questions. That's what I'm here for.
It looks like I didn't scroll back far enough to
Did I
find
get
all the questions, but you found them all. You found
Okay.
I think we're updated with the questions that have been asked
Yes.
so far.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Want to make sure I wasn't missing anything.
Mike has his hand raised, so go ahead.
Please.
So for the getting participants, for the external participants for the kind of evaluation, what's the process like? What would the process be like? Would you go out, send a survey out to everybody, or just kind of reach out to people you know who are kind of interested or ready into joining, and kind of both?
Actually, I would say a combination of that plus a few other things. So definitely sending out. So if you happen, let's say you have a newsletter that already goes out to the community, right? You can say, hey, here's a great opportunity for you all to be engaged with us. We're going to have focus groups. We're going to have food and drink. We're going to have something to entice you while you're there. We're looking for volunteers. You can send it out that way. If there are certain people are highly engaged in the library already, who are going to be happy to participate, never hurts to reach out to them. But I'm also going to suggest that you try to find the people who are less engaged as well.
Okay.
Make sure that you're actually getting it. So That may mean going out to a different public organization, a community center, senior home, something like that, where and seeing if anyone there wants to engage, and also even hosting it there, going to those locations and getting permission to set up get a room or something and do the actual conversation there. Have them do the evaluation of whether it's a policy, whether it's asking about collections, but do it in that space instead of asking them to come to you. Because one of the things we definitely know is we lose people because of the time and the ability to get to the location, excuse me, get to the location and spend that extra time. But if you can go to them and meet them where they're at, you might catch a few of those people who haven't engaged as much. And you might hopefully hear some of the things that you've been, trying to parse out that you just haven't been able to confirm. Because you're always talking to the highly engaged, the ones who are happy to share information and know that you're going to respond as well. So yeah.
Thank you. I like that. That was a good answer.
I tried.
Good ideas there. I like that. Going to a location, I think, is really key.
Yep.
Like you said, transportation, or maybe the time, or childcare, everything can happen. So
all those things that we know are there, but we hope that people will work around them, but they have to be enticed to work around them. And since we in libraries don't have the funding to pay people to fully engage in these types of activities, we sometimes have to just take away the barriers and go to where they're at so they don't have to worry about it anymore. Of course, the other joke that I heard the other day was that you could also invite the Girl Scouts to set up their cookie booths right outside. And while people are there to buy the cookies, ask them about the library, because I've seen the flocking, right? I've seen the flocking of people to the girls who set up the booths. Not that I didn't flock as well to buy mine, but it amazed me how long people would stand around while they were waiting to get in line for the cookies, and you could actually engage in conversation with them about other things. So just a thought, consider the collaboration with the Girl Scouts in the local region and invite them to come to the outskirts of the library to set up their cookie booths. And while you're there, have some conversations with people about the library as well.
thank you.
Mhm. Other questions? That's a really good one. How to be inclusive and participatory in our assessment process is really, it's more difficult. It really is, because it is time consuming. It really is time consuming. And anyone who's planned a project in the library or planned an event knows that you can spend a lot of time planning and then have no one show up and realize that you're not actually connecting with as many people as you want to, despite your hopes. So yeah, where I grew up, the public library was right next to the senior center, and then also right across the street from the health center. And so there were lots of opportunities for people to see the public library as a place to also go. But other places aren't necessarily centered that way. So it was easier for our public library to engage with different populations. There was also a community center 3 blocks down the street, plus the baseball and the softball fields. And so you see that because of that location, people who maybe normally wouldn't go to the library would find their way there. So in my family, my brother was the athlete, I was the reader. Because my brother played baseball, I got dropped off at the library before his game started. And the only reason I got to go to the library is because my brother played baseball. It wasn't that mom and dad didn't care, it's just that that's an extra trip across town. And we can't afford the extra trip across town, but my brother has a game schedule, so we have to go across town. Sports were priority at the time, so it worked out for me very well. All right, other questions? I know it's Friday and you all are all completely, as my dad says, plumb tuckered out. So, the thing I definitely will say is I encourage you, invite you to definitely also reach out to me. I'm easy to find, and I will make sure that my information is on the slides that I will be providing. Easy ways, multiple ways to contact me or to engage with me. Even if we don't have the opportunity to engage in a type of consultation, I'm always happy to have conversations. I'm always happy to share resources for anyone who's interested in looking for things. And I have so many resource lists that I've just gathered over the last few years. So typically that you're looking for it, I probably already have it. Feel free to ask me for it. I'm happy to share.
Will you have your email for us, or would you mind email me any questions?
I will actually also go ahead and put in the chat. Best way to find me It's also, if you find me on my website, it has a messaging process, but if you just look up
Okay.
kawanna@gmail.com, and I've included that on the slides that will be posted and shared as well.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. No, thank you all for coming. As much as I love professional development, I know as much as you all probably do too, I know you have jobs to do. There's also the work, the daily work that has to be done. So it's always a little bit difficult to take some time out to fully engage.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bright. It's a good program, good questions, good answers. For those of you who are in the southeastern region, we have opportunities coming up for consultations with Dr. Bright for EDI assessments that will be paid for by the council, but that's limited to those of you who are in our 8 counties. And that will be in the follow-up email that we will send out, was a form to complete for that. So if you want to continue the conversation with her, or if you have ideas for your own library, that is the opportunity to get that paid for. So that's coming up, and those applications are open through the month of March. So this is great.